Hello to all my Christchurch Glendale parishioners. This is Father Nick Avancho coming to you once again as a small head in the top right corner of a screen, continuing our adult ed series on heretics for armchair theologians with the second chapter that we're doing virtually and apart, which is on the Donatist controversy, which is, unlike the Trinity we did last time, one probably fewer people have heard of. And so, after having read the chapter, let's dive in and talk about what's in there. So, the Donatist controversy was one of the very, very early controversies of the Church, and begins with a bit of the politics that followed directly after the death of Christ in the Apostolic era, as Christianity began to actually get a footing and grow within the Roman Empire, rather than simply being a disruption of kind of the Jewish world. It started to spread and get enough followers and enough momentum to actually come up on the radar of the Romans and of the political authorities of the time as a possible threat to the control of the Roman Empire. That it could be an opposing force that was gathering enough to actually be worthy of some level of concern. Whereas when you see in the Gospels, the Christian church is more of a concern to the Jews and a non-issue to the Romans. And the Romans only start caring insofar as they're worried about the Jews getting too upset about it and causing unrest amongst themselves. But then Christians start to become a thorn in the side of the empire of their own right. And that is where all of the stories of the early martyrs, of those going to the Colosseum to be fed to lions, of the kind of persecutions by Nero and some of the other major Roman empires come from. All of these persecutions were driven partly by a desire for political stability, in that Christians were not too keen on swearing an oath to the emperor or offering sacrifices to the emperor, as the Romans considered him one of the pantheon of gods. And so Christians were somewhat compelled by the Roman establishment to make those deferences to the empire, and were loath to do so, and so there was an obvious conflict. And the Romans, in order to maintain power, dealt with opposition very severely. Because, when you think about it, the Roman Empire encompassed the entire circumference of the Mediterranean Sea, North Africa, and Italy over through Spain and over through Germany and France, and all of those lands all around the Mediterranean. And travel, obviously, was not as easy as it is today, and therefore governing a landmass of that size and a people group of that diversity is not an easy thing. It's very easy for conflicts to spring up across the empire without the government's ability to totally put down rebellion. It's very easy for empires of that size to break apart. As we have now seen, there are no empires really of that nature anymore. And in the last couple centuries, we've seen the British Empire go from literally having a country in every time zone to once again being the 4 countries of the British Isles. And so there is a great difficulty in governing territory of that expanse and of that magnitude without being extremely stiff on dissension and being a bit paranoid about those type of uprisings and loss of territory. And so that is how the Roman emperors tended to handle it, in addition to their own personality cult. Now, the kind of height of these persecutions came under the Emperor Diocletian in the years 300 to 312. There had been other persecutions. Nero, the emperor famous for the somewhat mythical playing the fiddle as Rome burnt, was also famous for using the burning bodies of Christian martyrs to light his house parties. But Christians were kind of a commonly martyred and persecuted thing throughout the early Roman Empire, but Diocletian made a bit of a science out of it, and it is of those persecutions that many of the famous martyrs become known. However, those persecutions stopped rather abruptly when the emperor in the picture on the right of this slide came into being and declared Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire with the Edict of Milan in the year 313. That is the Emperor Constantine, who in battle is said to have seen an image of the Chi Rho, the sort of P with an X through it that is the first two letters of Christ in Greek, that stands for Christ and is a symbol of Jesus' name, and supposedly saw the words in Greek and tuto nica, or in Latin in hoc signo vinces, which means in this sign conquer. And it was after that revelation that he was, one, victorious, and two, decided to unite the Roman Empire under the Christian banner. And politically, Constantine sought to use Christianity as a way to unite the empire across its entire breadth and scope and get rid of some of those clashing cultures, clashing religions, clashing civilizations that threatened the unity of the Roman Empire. If we could unite everyone under the Christian flag, either by faith or by force, they could guarantee some stability to the empire. And as we talked about in the last video with the Council of Nicaea, it didn't always work out as well as Constantine would have hoped, because as things went on, Christianity didn't remain a monolith either. There were conflicts amongst different groups of Christians that sought to tear apart the unity he was looking for, and so he continued to call councils to come up with one teaching of the church that everyone could unite around. Now, there's great debate amongst historians how dogmatically interested, how devout Emperor Constantine actually was, and how much he saw Christianity as a very good political tool for his ends. And it was probably a mixture of both. He, following the early church practice, was not baptized until his deathbed. They liked to do that just in case you got any mortal sinning in after baptism. They wanted to make sure that time was as short as humanly possible. But he was not a cleric of any sort, and it's questionable how much he really adhered to Christian doctrine, although he is responsible for the notion of Christendom, for making Christianity not only legal within the Roman Empire, as Judaism was, but the actual state religion of Rome. And so persecutions didn't end, they simply changed groups. It was now the pagans who refused to get with the Christian religion who were being persecuted, similar to how Diocletian was persecuting the Christians. And this leads to one of the major church figures of that early time, and that is St. Augustine of Hippo. He is named for the town of Hippo Regius, where he was bishop in modern-day Algeria, in North Africa, in what was still considered the Roman Empire on the southern shore of the Mediterranean. But he is, for all intents and purposes, considered the most influential theologian of the Western Church. One of the preeminent Latin doctors of the Church, a very, very prolific writer, and one who has had influence on just about every theologian that has come after him. Many of those theologians considering themselves simply exegetes of Augustine. He was also one of the first people to write an autobiography of himself, a spiritual autobiography known as Confessions, in which he details his journey from birth through different belief systems of the time until he came to Christianity, and then discusses some of the ideas and things that brought him to Christianity and what he found there. But it's one of the first spiritual Christian writings that is done from a biographical perspective, where he is actually talking about his life, his feelings, what he found, and is one of the kind of seminal works of theology. It is a very interesting read because his life ventured through a lot of odd religious traditions and ideas before he eventually became a Christian and was elected bishop of Hippo Regius. But he was born to a pagan father and a Christian mother, Saint Monica being the Christian mother. And it's said that on his father's deathbed he converted him to Christianity. But he was skeptical of his mother's Christian faith for a long time throughout his life, and went through schools of thought like Neoplatonism, which was a recovery of the ideas of Plato, the Greek philosopher, Manichaeanism, which was similar to Marcionism and some of the heresies we discussed earlier in this book, was a dualistic kind of mystery religion. All things that are material are evil and created by the bad God, and everything spiritual and invisible is good and created by the good God, and your job is to get rid of everything material. One of the extremely ascetical, horrible fasting and self-punishment to get rid of the flesh type of traditions that he did end up leaving, obviously. But he took insights from all of these different traditions on through his writing, and you see their influences in his later theology, for which he is well known. He also was a fairly kind of party person in his young life. He was definitely not what would generally be called a bishop, and he was quite fond of women, and that became kind of also a recurring theme throughout his spiritual autobiography and his own views of theology. He very much saw himself as unworthy of the position that he held at the end of his life, of any merit of God. He himself was unworthy, and so he pioneered a lot of the idea of grace, of unmerited favor by God, of that we can earn no respect of God of our own power, but God simply gifts us the ability to be seen as good before him, because we have no real good in us by ourselves, due to one of his other concepts, original sin. Now, a lot of this thought of sin and unworthiness focused for Augustine around sex and marriage, because that was his personal vice prior to journeying through the various intellectual schools. And there is a narrative in Confessions where he is tempted by someone trying to keep him from converting to Christianity, who locked him in a room with a prostitute all night, and instead of sleeping together, he is said to have preached to her all night and converted her to Christianity. And so you can see that theme through his life, and it plays out in some of his theology with the idea that original sin passes down by birth, and a sort of dislike of all things flesh is also associated with his thought. He is much less valued in the Eastern Church than he is in the Western Church. He is responsible largely for the ideas of original sin, of what Calvin would later interpret to be total depravity, that there is no good in humans apart from what good can be given to them by God. And that's been a polarizing view throughout the church. Calvin, as I just said, latched onto it heavily during the Reformation and considered himself largely a scholar of Augustine, reinterpreting Augustine when the Reformation came about. And The Eastern Church sees creation from a much different perspective and sees much more good in the simple being of things than Augustine did. Augustine at the fall saw creation as entirely broken, entirely worthless, having lost all good in it. Whereas in the Eastern Church, it's much more like there was a small stain on creation that needed to be blotted out, but not that creation was utterly irredeemable of itself. Now, that is a vast simplification of an immense theological tradition, but you can see that Augustine started from the perspective of fallenness and salvation, whereas the Eastern Church tends to start from the goodness of creation and the goodness of what God has made and moves through the rest of the story. For Augustine, the story really starts with the fall, that God created everything good, and the emphasis being on we messed it up. And it is our entire arc of our journey to kind of make up for that mess up, to come back into union with God. Whereas the Eastern Church sees us having been created in union with God, fallen out, and still coming back to that perfect union of God. It's a bit of a difference of emphasis, but that could be a lecture in itself. And there is a great book I'll show you at the end of this called Augustine for Armchair Theologians, if you wish to know more about his thought, his life, and his contribution. But almost all Western Christian traditions, that is, most of the Christian traditions that you would be familiar with, other than Eastern Orthodoxy and some of the Coptic and more obscure Middle Eastern Christian traditions, really owe a lot of their thought to Augustine of Hippo. He was also, in North Africa, not a Roman by his own ethnic right. He was a member of a people group called the Berbers, that his mother was also believed to be a member of. And as I said, the Roman Empire encompassed a lot of different places and people, and it's pretty difficult amongst such a diverse and large group not to engender certain long created conflicts, and one was between the Berber peoples and the Romans, who saw the Romans as intruders on what was naturally their land, their traditions, their language. And this will come to a head with the Donatist controversy as the church becomes more and more culturally Roman, as the language of the church becomes Latin, not Berber, as the culture of the church shifts kind of out of their hands and almost forces Romanism on them to a certain point if they want to be members of the church. And so that conflict starts to bubble up. Now, there are a couple kind of broad categories that help to group some of these heretical issues together. And especially in Donatism, there are two major ones. And the first is Rigorism. I love this picture. But, and no, not all nuns are like that. But Rigorism is a ethical system where all questions are decided with the assumption of strict law and guilt. If there's a question over what you did, it's probably because you did something wrong and you should feel bad about it. And that you will never really do anything right. There's always something you could have done better. There is always something you could have brought to confession. And even when you make a confession, you could have made a better confession. It's that sort of extreme adherence to the rules, forgetting the spirit of why the rule is there for the sake of enforcing every little bit of the letter of the law. And this is not unique to Christianity. There are rigorous traditions of almost every philosophical system, and it often comes from a desire for purity. these types of heresies, of breakaways, tend to come out of changes to the long established traditions, intellectual framework of a religious group. Rigorism is often motivated by a desire for purity, of something changed, has diluted, has polluted the teaching of the church, has given up on the ethics that we believed in, and we're the ones who are standing up for the right rules, the right way of doing things. Everyone else has just made it too easy, has given up on the difficulty of the teaching. It's the sort of, well, we kept relaxing the rules because we didn't feel like behaving anymore. And so we just made a small exception that led to a bigger exception that led to a bigger exception. And the slippery slope argument that leads to, and if we give up that little inch of flex, that little inch of ground, suddenly there will be no rules whatsoever. Everything will be anarchy. It's those type of people who tend to cling to rigorist ideas. But because people are people, it tends to be somewhat cannibalistic of the group. Because there will always be another section that decides that they are even stricter than the first one. And then when there are people who mess up in that group, a smaller group of that group will split off, being the only ones who can really keep the faith, really do what they're supposed to. And the group keeps getting smaller and smaller by kicking out everyone they think isn't as good as them, and eventually you're on an island by yourself because you're the only one you think can do everything you think you need to do. Rigorous traditions also tend to focus on very specific rules at the expense of other rules. They're very rarely evenly enforcing everything. There are certain specific transgressions that are unforgivable, and other rules that are there, but we don't really care about them as much. They don't have that same weight of shame. This is a lot of times seen in evangelicalism and purity culture. The idea that, there are these injunctions and commandments in Christianity for love of neighbor, for giving, for prayer, but those things are all things you can grow in, things that you may not be good at all the time. But if you step out of sexual morality, then you are just completely out of the group. That was unforgivable. That is so far outside of the pale of what Christianity means that you just can't be a part of the group anymore. In reality, it's a transgression of the commandments like anything else. But that's the one that they attach a lot of weight to. That's the one they choose to define their group against. And the issue that usually gets picked is the one that most recently had a change in thinking around it. And I could probably go on for a long time, but I think we've all seen examples of these types of reactions to new thinking, new change, new ideas and new rules. There's always, well, this is just a corruption of what we used to think. This is just a pollution of the good we used to have. Now there's just no rules at all anymore. And that's the type of group that tends to cling to rigorism. A slight turn on that is the idea of restorationism. And this is another one that in a lot of places we've probably seen some example of. And it is the desire and the tradition to return to the earlier, the purer form. The idea that over time we've diluted, we've corrupted the faith that was handed to us at the beginning. And really, if we want to do what we're supposed to do, we need to get back to what we were given at the beginning. We need to go back to that golden age of being the church. We need to go back to what the early church did. We want to get rid of all this institutionalism, everything that came from the Middle Ages, and the structures of the church, and we want to get back to just these loose house gatherings of Christians as the early church was, because that's a more pure form of the faith. And those types of criticisms also tend to grow breakaway segments over time. As things continue to change, there's always this nagging belief in the back of people's heads that what used to be is better than what is becoming. That there was a golden age of the church, and the idea of what that golden age is always changes. But people forget that that time also had its problems and was looking back at what it thought was a golden age. We look back to, in some circles, to wanting to become the early church. Well, there was an incredible community, an incredible fervor around Christianity, and it was a movement that was so countercultural, and there's interest in that. But Christians were also being fed to lions and persecuted. I mean, they had their own problems that we don't have now. There is no golden age. Every age has its problems. We often just long for different problems. But it comes from the belief that time has corrupted a movement and it needs to be renewed, to be brought back to what it was always intended to be, which is always generally the time closest to its institution. The best modern example of a restorationist tradition is Mormonism. And in the picture on the right, I included the Kirtland, Ohio Temple, which was the first Mormon temple built in the United States, just outside of Cleveland in Kirtland, Ohio. You can go tour it. It's not the original one, as that was burned down, but is a perfect replica in a lot of ways, and is just an interesting thing in itself. But Mormons believe that they were given special revelation through the prophecies of Joseph Smith, showing what the gospel was always intended to be, restoring the Church of Jesus Christ as it was intended from the beginning and was distorted through time and fell away from the gospel. Thus they are the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of saints in those last days after the final prophet gave the final dispensation of grace to show what the gospel was always supposed to be. And so they believe themselves a restoration of Christianity, that ideas like the Trinity were misguided pollutions of the faith, and they're getting back to the real kernel of truth. Now, both of these things are, at their hearts, reactions to change above all else. And there becomes this dichotomy in the fourth bullet point of understanding change in the church as decadence or development of doctrine. Cardinal Newman, who was an Anglican priest and teacher who was made a cardinal in the Roman Church upon his conversion to Roman Catholicism, kind of believed in the development of doctrine. It was, that term is associated with him, in that over time our understandings become clearer, our doctrines become more detailed, and that is normal growth, not a somehow corruption of what we knew perfectly at the beginning, but rather over time we grow in our understanding of the faith. The church changes as it grows even better and better and better. But some understand faith to have been deposited perfectly at the beginning. We knew everything right then, and it just went on a downslope through time, and at some point we need to get back to what we knew at the beginning. And it's that tension that drives restorationist movements. And those two types of movements tended to encapsulate what Donatism really was. The picture on the right, above it, it says Donatus Hereticus, Donatus the heretic, with a drawing of him. The little kind of 9 above the T is a abbreviation for US. Old Latin is full of little pictorial abbreviations in order to save space on very expensive paper. And so even if you know Latin, it can take a little while to figure out all the little shortcuts that the scribes made. But the whole movement was named for its leader, Donatus the Great. And it grew primarily out of not a religious but an ethnic conflict that I mentioned before, between the Berbers and the Romans, and the fact that the body of the church, the thought of the church, was moving far more into the Roman cultural framework than it was moving into the Berber cultural framework. The language of the church became Latin. It was governed from Rome, and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope of Rome, became its head. And it took on a Roman character, which, as I said before, the Berbers saw as the oppressor, the intruder. And so they saw the conflict of wanting to be a member of the Christian church, but feeling like in order to do that, you had to give up a fair bit of ground to the Romans. And so an obvious split was set up to occur, where there would be a ethnically Berber instantiation of Christianity. And part of that became a very rigorous definition of what was a more pure idea of Christianity. Excuse me. And the main sticking point for the two groups was getting back to the persecutions that I talked about at the beginning of the video, which was how did people respond to the persecution of the Roman government? Did they give at all, or did they gladly and stoically go to the Colosseum? This kind of came to a head when the Bishop of Carthage was consecrated. One of the bishops had, upon the threats of the Roman Empire, given away some books that he said were Bibles and religious books, as the Romans were trying to tamp down on Christianity spreading amongst the people. Now, there was a significant rumor that what he gave them wasn't Christian literature at all, and because they were illiterate, how would they have known? But the Donatists believed that if you gave even the smallest inch, that you were then a traitor. You were then no longer to be included in the Christian group, unless you perfectly stood up to the Roman Empire and did not give at all. You were a traitor and no longer worthy of inclusion in the community. And so they tended to be a breakaway on the grounds of who is the most committed to the church. They believed that the consecration of the Bishop of Carthage was not valid because one of the bishops, like I said, had given just a little bit, even though it was kind of a deceptive bit, under the pressure of the Roman Empire. Because he didn't stand up perfectly, he was absolutely not worthy of being included in the good clergy, the proper clergy of the church. He was no longer worthy to be a bishop, and therefore was no longer validly a bishop. And it gets back to a tension we talked about earlier with Montanism, that is, of whether the authority as a cleric comes from personal holiness or institutional authority. Am I a priest because I am personally a lot holier than everyone else? I think we all know that's not true. Or am I a priest because I was made a priest by the institution of the church and by the apostolic succession of bishops? The church obviously went with the second belief, that it comes from the office, not necessarily the person. However, that was a very Roman understanding of power, that your power came from the office that you hold rather than from yourself. I mean, as Rome built up its bureaucracy of governors, and I mean, you hear of Pontius Pilate being governor of Caesarea, and you see those kind of institutional frameworks build up, you see how there would need to be a less personality-based idea of how power works. In small societies, the most respected person in the group has the most power. It comes from your own charisma, your own ability to stand up as a leader in your group, in your society. And so clerical power kind of followed those two traditions of different peoples. The Romans believing that, like the government, it was a large and bureaucratic and institutional machine, and the Berbers, like a tribal people, thinking that it more came out of influence and the agreement of the group on who the influencers are. And this question became a problem when relating to the sacraments of the church. As I mentioned, the Donatists believed that because that one bishop was not personally holy enough, his participation in the consecration of another bishop was no longer valid. He wasn't worthy of being a bishop anymore in their eyes, and so nothing he did was valid anymore. That his ability to perform the sacraments of the church depended on his own personal character and holiness. Whereas St. Augustine, in weighing in on this topic, created the doctrine referred to as ex opere operato. You can find a statement of this in the 39 articles found at the back of the prayer book in the mid-800s of pages. But it's the belief that sacraments are given their validity by their form, by the ritual by which they're performed, and the intention of the cleric performing it, not by the personal character, goodness, or worthiness of that cleric. Ex opere operato in Latin means by the work worked. The sacrament is accomplished by the simple act of performing the sacrament, not by the extreme goodness or character or charisma or esteem of the person doing the sacrament. The personal holiness of the cleric doesn't affect his ability to be a valid cleric. A cleric is a priest by virtue of his or her office, not by virtue of his or her personality. And that became an important distinction in the church because, especially through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and obviously till today, clerics are people, and some are better than others, some mess up in extreme ways, and throughout the history of the church there have been some absolutely terrible clerics. But that did not impede the church from being the church, and the personal failings of priests does not affect God's ability to still work through his sacraments and work through his church. But it is an acknowledgement by St. Augustine that priests are people, that we are imperfect, and it is also an important acknowledgement that it is not us by our own power confecting the sacraments, but rather Christ working through that particular priest. The priest standing in persona Christi, meaning in the image, in the person of Christ, when they perform the Eucharist, when they perform the sacraments. And one icon that I love is what I put to the right, which is Christ himself dressed in Mass vestments, holding up the Eucharist that is his own body and blood. That every time the Eucharist is performed, Christ is both priest and offering. And so that brings us to the final question posed by this type of movement, and that is, what is the effect of the sacraments? And this has been an issue that has affected the church from its earliest days through the Reformation and still divides Christians today. And that is, do the sacraments have any effect apart from the participation or belief of the recipient? Does communion in itself have any value apart from my belief in it? Is it just entirely symbolic, a kind of play acting of the Last Supper, remembering what Jesus did in his last days? Or is Christ somehow truly and physically present in the bread and wine of the Eucharist? Is baptism just a confession of faith, just an opportunity to own the label of Christian and a ceremony to represent it? Or is there something that happens to the person in baptism, something that actually is done by the act of the sacrament? And you can see these tensions still today. I mean, the reason that Baptists baptize adults and not infants is because they believe that for it to have any real effect, there has to be intellectual engagement on the part of the baptized person. That really it is just a representation of saying, I believe in all of this, rather than having any effect of its own. In the same way they believe that the Eucharist is just a remembrance of what happened, not anything necessarily grace-giving in itself. On the absolute other side of that debate, you have a superstitious piety. It was very popular in the Middle Ages, a kind of piety that feared the bread and wine of the Eucharist, that believed that if you broke the bread unworthily, it would bleed as Christ. That which believed that if you weren't perfect and had just come from confession when you took Eucharist, you'd be struck down by lightning and die at the altar. That believed the priests to be in many ways superhuman in their ability to bring God into their own hands on the altar. This type of over-mysticism that threatens to turn the sacraments of the Church into a magical experience rather than one of prayer, grace, and the action of God, but rather a sort of novelty of the sacraments being some way to twist the power of God by humans, of casting a spell almost, and undo fear and reverence of godly objects. That idea that I spoke of at the beginning, that if you weren't baptized only minutes before your death, you would somehow transgress the laws before you die, and then your one get out of jail free card was gone, and you would die and be thrust into hell because you somehow didn't get the perfect formula right. And so there is danger on both sides of this debate. But as Anglicans, like with everything, we tend to rest somewhere in the middle. Augustine himself defined sacraments as an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, which, like many things in the Anglican tradition, is an answer that holds a few different meanings in tension. We affirm the real presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament of the altar, but also are less likely, as you see in the picture to the right of the slide, which is a host and a monstrance, to simply hold up the Eucharist for adoration as the actual body and blood of God. Rather, there is a belief that the sacrament isn't complete without some reception of it, without the people taking it, which was its original intention to begin with, rather than to simply be sat there and stared at as if it were somehow more the presence of God than any other thing in the world, in the creation. And so the Anglican Church sits in the middle of this debate. And don't get me wrong, there are true Anglicans who hold the high Catholic position, much like myself, that the sacraments have deep effect whether you believe in them or not. And there are true and faithful Anglicans who hold much more to the Protestant side of things, that believe the sacraments to be much more symbolic of real things happening in the heart of the Christian, but not necessarily magical spells that do something of their own power. And so it's a question to play with that still divides Christians to this day. And the Reformation saw a certain restorationism in taking the magic beliefs out of the sacraments, in like the Baptists do, which are a holdover from strict Calvinism in the Reformation, to demystify the sacraments, that really they gained all of that mysticism during the Middle Ages that they were never meant to have, and we're getting back to the pure faith that was instituted at the beginning. And so you see these tensions constantly play out as things change over time in the church, as different people have different ideas, and the institution has to pick a position on different things. People have various reactions to change then and certainly now. There is nothing new under the sun. If anything, most of these heresies are ways in which people reacted to the changing times and ideas that were happening around them. Some for better and some for worse. The better tend to be adopted as the orthodox position, the worse tend to be relegated to the heresies. But that is a bit about the idea of what happened at the Donatist controversy. It was wrapped up in much more than interpretations of Christianity. It was wrapped up in conflicts between government and the people, in people groups under that government, and in ideas of power and of purity within the Christian church. But largely, Augustine of Hippo held together the Christian church through this controversy and paved the way for a much, in many ways, healthier understanding of what it means to be a good Christian, what it means to be a cleric, and a sinful and broken human at the same time, rather than having to divide those two things, thinking that to be a good Christian, I have to be perfect, and if I'm not perfect, I'm not a good Christian. And it's that lesson that I think we can fully take away from the condemnation of these type of rigorous puritanical groups, which popped up many times after the Donatist controversy, but are a constant threat to religion as a damaging force of saying that if you are human, you can't be a good Christian. And obviously, that is simply not the case. St. Augustine made it clear that you can be both a fallen human and a good Christian, an imperfect person and a minister of God. And all of those things can play together, as messy and as difficult to understand as that is. The last bit of this chapter that I'll touched on Augustine's idea of the visible and invisible church, which was kind of a consequence of that belief that you can be imperfect and a Christian. That it isn't the church's job to judge who is in and who is out. That is God's job. There are certainly people who call themselves Christian who likely aren't, and there are people who don't call themselves Christian who are closer to God than many who do. And Augustine believed that both of those things can exist, and it's God's job to sort it out and not ours. And so all of those rigorous puritanical traditions really are just our own arrogance of trying to be God rather than letting God do his own job. And so, if while you are isolated in your own homes, you are finding yourself bored and want to do some more reading on any of the people or topics I've talked about today, there are two books that I would recommend. One, the Augustine volume of the same For Armchair Theologians book series that we've been going through, which is equally good an explanation of St. Augustine and equally light and funny as this book is. And if you wish to read him in his own hand, there are plenty of translations of Confessions that are available all over Amazon or free online, that you can read his own life story and thought, although I will admit it is a bit more dense and difficult to slog through than the Armchair Theologian's comic-y version. But if you have any questions, obviously you know how to reach me as well, and I am around like all of you, willing to talk about whatever you need, so please feel free to reach out to me. The next chapter of this book is on kind of the anti-Donatist Pelagius, who made a similar movement within the church, but coming at it from a bit of a different angle, and once again ran afoul of St. Augustine. And so we will cover that next week-ish as I am able to make another one of these videos. But thank you for watching, and I hope we can get together soon. If you have any questions or you simply want to talk about any of this, please contact me whenever you would like. God bless.